All right. We are now recording. With that, everyone, I'm really pleased to introduce Mike Pulford, who's a bit of a diamond in the rough. I just was talking with him about some other stuff and realized that I was just sitting in front of somebody with master's level expertise in AI policy. And I was looking for a speaker, so things worked out really well. I'm very excited to hear what Michael has to say, both on the podcast episode that was the assigned reading for this week, as well as his own research and just general thoughts in the space. And with that, Mike, take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Joan. Should I put this full screen here? No, it's all good. Should I put the presentation full yes. Screen? Yeah. There we go. All right. Yeah. So as I've been introduced, I'm Mike. My background, I did my undergrad in political science, and then I did my master's in international public policy. So a lot of my policy expertise is kind of coming at it from a political lens. And in AI, that's been fairly relevant over the past 5 to 10 years. So that's kind of the angle with which I come at a lot of these things, as you'll probably see throughout the presentation. So first things first, kind of where are we today? As the podcast mentions, there are several existing regulations and kind of frameworks through which AI is regulated currently. We have the General Data Protection Regulation, which doesn't target AI specifically, and I'll get more into that in a second. The Digital Services Act and the supposed pause on the release of large language models. So GDPR, just like a quick summary, regulates the collection and use of personal data by private corporations. It also protects the individual from the use of your data by governments. I think this is actually a pretty large part of regulating AI, because data is so important in informing AI and how AI can be used. The Digital Services Act targets hate speech and harmful content. This one's interesting to me as well, because in Europe, this is much more applicable. Whereas in North America, specifically political speech, is very well protected by the American Constitution, for example, and is therefore, it's difficult to regulate that. Basically, anything that comes under the guise of political speech is basically, you can say whatever you want. And that's going to be very interesting moving forward with AI generated advertisements, images, statements, that you can't really sue someone for defamation or, making something up per se. So that's going to be an interesting one to follow.
Just to clarify, are these two, GDPR and the Digital Services Act, those are both regulations in the EU?
They are enacted by the EU. They impact a larger umbrella than that because of data entering and leaving. So it impacts the online presence in North America, for example, and Asia. But the regulation itself is enacted within the EU. And finally, kind of this pause, talking about pausing the release of new large language models. I see this more of a statement of intent rather than a realistic goal. From my brief chats with Joan and just my general understanding, it doesn't seem that this is something that the private sector is really interested in following up on. But having people make that statement is definitely a start, and it's valuable.
I just wanted to add, the pause was signed by Elon Musk and a bunch of Defective Culturalists people, and those people, they don't actually understand the stuff that's going on with the AI. We're nowhere near a catastrophic level of super intelligence happening. It's not realistic, but just wanted to.
Right. Yeah, of course. And I think too, like, as it's mentioned in the article, it's like with some regulations, like I think they use like a car crash, for example. Do I click admit here?
No,
we got it? Sweet. You can like retroactively be like, okay, we made a mistake here. Let's fix that. But as they say in the podcast, it's like with some like catastrophic AI event, can you retroactively regulate that for future, or is that kind of like the be all end all? So just diving into the policy, I think that's kind of where I'm going to spend most of my time. There's a few difficulties with just developing policy in general. The policy process is a long one, and there are a lot of political things that kind of go into how and why policy is developed. So the first thing you need to develop any sort of policy is the political will to actually get it done. Are the people in power convinced that this is necessary? And are they convinced that that fits within their purview of how they want regulation to run? And also, are the people that elected them going to be for or against this type of regulation? So I just kind of put together three kind of like very basic different types of governments, right? So government A might be focused on the economic benefit of a technology. That's going to lead to a fairly hands-off approach when it comes to regulation. And you're going to see a lot more innovation. You're going to see a lot more growth in that sector, which can be a very good thing. And as we'll get into, there's a fine line between allowing growth and not allowing it to run rampant. Government B focused on protecting civil liberties. This is more your individual freedoms. That's something like the GDPR. Protecting your data and its use is very valuable in this regard. That's something that government B would probably be interested in. And this would err on the side of suppression. So you're going to see less innovation you're going to see innovation leaving at the expense of personal information being more protected. And C, government C focused on national security. So this is going to focus a lot on the monitoring of the use of technology, is likely at the expense of civil liberties and research and development. The benefits of this is that it's very fast-paced. National security historically is a very easy lens through which you can get bipartisan agreement on things. It's very easy to argue, oh, well, why wouldn't you be interested in national security? And so politically speaking, it's very expedient.
Especially for, like, I'm from the United States and we passed our quantum initiative in 2019. And at that time, it's the Trump administration, almost no unity in any political space. And yet that quantum initiative passed with unanimous support from Republicans and Democrats. And the reason is because funding quantum technologies and innovation in the United States is almost entirely motivated. We're a C country. It's almost entirely motivated by national security arguments. The US is very paranoid. We're worried we're going to lose our position to China or someone else.
Well, and additionally, being how fractured American politics are specifically, I mean, it's the case, I think, in most of the Western Hemisphere, but the US, they don't agree on anything, right? So national security is the one thing where you can kind of get everyone on the same page. And that has its benefits, obviously. It also has drawbacks, because that paranoia can escalate, right?
Just going back for 1 second.
Yeah, totally.
What I really love about this is that, as we've talked in previous conversations about persuasion, how do you go about persuading someone on the other end who isn't already on your side? Thinking through what sorts of priorities or focuses does that person care about is a critical component to developing a persuasive argument. And we're talking about governments here, but this could be somebody, just an individual across the side of the room. And if you've noticed that, hey, I've been making arguments about diversity and inclusion for 10 weeks, and this person still isn't on my side, maybe that's not the argument I need to be making. Practicing thinking about all the different arguments you could make for the same idea is a really effective tool when it comes to being able to persuade a room full of people.
Definitely, the framing of an argument is, I think, very valuable.
It's about understanding what you're talking to, for sure.
And a big piece of that is listening to them, giving them the space to tell you where they're coming from, what is important.
You should also look into Jonathan Haidt's 5 or 6 moral foundations.
We should put it in the Discord. Got it later.
Yeah, another even aspect of that too is like being opportunistic with recognizing who might be more receptive to an idea, right? Like in Canada, we've had the same government in power for fairly long period of time at this point. But that can change within 6 months, right? So, taking advantage of, oh, these people are in government, they have the ability to change this right now. We need to like take advantage of that. So some other difficulties with the policy process, aside from convincing people that it's actually important to do in the first place, is the getting from there to enacting the policy. You need to, there are so many levels to it, and policy experts are often not experts in the field in which they're attempting to regulate, right? So
Yes.
to a large extent, it's involving people like you guys that are coming at it with different expertise and the willingness to engage with policy workers. So getting those expert groups, getting stakeholders that are working in the field and kind of working with them to find a policy that works for both sides. One of the big things is that policy, generally speaking, relies on people being willing to follow it. There's very rarely a regulation that completely prevents people from breaking that regulation, right? Like laws are broken all the time. I like a very simple example is cars, right? It's like we have speed limits, you have to wear seatbelts, but we build cars that can drive exponentially faster than the speed limit, right? So you're relying on people to follow those rules. And additionally, there's not the resources to actually enforce that on a person-to-person basis, right? So applying that to AI and the kind of R&D of these like massive companies is that how do you convince them to follow your regulation, right? Because oftentimes these companies are able to kind of navigate the regulation at a higher level than the governments are able to implement it. So pinpointing those levers in which you can regulate certain parts of the technology or uses of the technology at a level where the companies are also able to kind of follow that regulation and working with them. And this goes into enforcement, because enforcement, I think, is the key. And I'm going to get into it a little bit more later, but having an idea of like, oh yeah, we could do this and this regulation would work really, really well. That's all well and good. But then how do you enforce that? How do you make sure people are following the letter that you've put down? And how do you like find the resources to enforce it? And that's kind of what I mentioned before, is like that thin line between completely no regulation and suppressing innovation. And that's where I thought it was really interesting in the podcast. They talk about kind of ethical charters as general guidelines within which people should work. And I think that's a great idea. It's a good starting point. But how do you operationalize that? How do you take those ethical charters and turn them into something that you can explicitly say this is against these charters and this is within the purview? And that's something where with these big companies, there's always an argument to be had, right? And even if they're able to argue with you about it for 2-3 years in like court, suddenly it's kind of irrelevant who ends up winning, right? The time has passed. So that's something we'll get into, kind of the ideas they lay out in the podcast. But that's something to keep in mind.
Two things that come up for me on this slide is that this slide bar between unregulated R&D and suppressed innovation could represent a set of counter arguments for what we're trying to do. You come to Google or you come to a researcher and say, well, we're going to try and come up with a set of ethical regulations for how you're going to develop your AI or your quantum. And they'll just say, oh, well, quantum isn't even working yet. Why are you trying to regulate something and suppress my ability to explore and figure it out before it's even happened? That's an argument that I've gotten before. And then,
I think it's also important, like in KW specifically, there's so many small startups and smaller level people doing very interesting and very important research, right? So it's creating regulation that doesn't over impact those people or kind of like push them out of the market, you know? And they talk about it in the podcast episode with the talk about like competitive advantage between the large companies. And that's, I think, a very difficult aspect to this, because the companies will always be able to pay whatever fine you put down, and they'll be able to kind of navigate those ins and outs. So one of the main parts of my research was kind of looking at the international use of AI and the difference between what it takes to regulate it on a national basis and an international basis. So just very quickly, domestic regulation, in my eyes, focuses on how are you regulating research and development? How are you regulating open use technologies like ChatGPT? And how are you kind of ensuring or at least monitoring the bias in these AIs? Whereas international regulation, you're looking at the cross-border use of AI. So election hacking, driving discourse, we're seeing a whole thing with TikTok right now. And so that, I think, is also very, very important. I think maybe that's more of a discussion for another day, because that goes to a whole other level. But I do think that's an important aspect of Canada's position within the kind of greater realm of AI regulation and policy discussion. So a lot of my research, and I ended up writing a policy piece for the government of Canada, effectively looking at how can Canada position itself globally as a leader, because Canada is kind of our MO internationally is being an ethical leader and kind of somewhat, or a country that states look at as kind of the upper echelon of proponent of ethics and ethical action. And that allows us to punch way above our weight in international forums. Like, you know, we don't have the population, we don't have a relatively large economy, but we have a lot of influence globally because of kind of different actions we've taken throughout history. And so I think this is specifically at AI, where we seem to have the political will, we have the expertise, we have like, we are like we have Quantum Valley here, right? So it's like we are there in terms of the technological side. So if we're able to develop or even start the conversation of some sort of regulation and policy in Canada, that allows us to then go into the international forum and kind of represent ourselves as a leader. And that, I think, is a very important way of positioning ourselves globally and maintaining that reputation. And that's important for Canada, politically speaking. But I think it's also important is that like the world looks for countries as leaders in this regard. And the EU has done a good job as of yet, kind of developing and enacting policy. But the EU as kind of a conglomerate is, if this makes sense, looking internationally within the EU because of the different countries, that it's somewhat insular in a lot of ways. So having Canada in combination with the EU, I think lends much more international influence to the concept of AI policy and regulation. So were we able to develop strong regulation, I think that's a very strong statement for the international community. And I think it would be likely that we would see people kind of following us, at least looking into that as a possibility and something that's important to continue looking into.
Sorry.
No, go for it.
You all probably heard me say many different times that Waterloo region holds a special place in the world if we want to make ethics a global thing. And this point that Mike is making hopefully drives home the important position that all of you now sit in, where this quantum ethics working group at PI is going to kick in with funding in the fall. And then it'll be up to us to think about how we can organize a successful campaign to get Canada to be positioned globally as an ethical leader in the development of quantum technologies. Because the case is easy to make. Canada emerged as a quantum leader because it was an early mover. We built Waterloo's Institute for Quantum Computing, before any other major government had invested. The IQC is the oldest institute of its kind. And now, this year, the government of Canada is trying to reaffirm its investment in quantum by dumping $360 million more into its national quantum strategy. But at this stage in the game, Canada is now competing with the United States, with China, with the EU. $360 million Canadian is nothing.
Yeah.
A drop in the bucket. We can't, Canada cannot compete economically. So it's gonna have to compete through being an early mover again, not on quantum this time, but quantum ethics. And then utilizing its global position as an ethical leader, which we can have problems with because Canada is incredibly racist, has a horrible background with its indigenous populations, and I can list many, many more things. But this reputation still exists, and we should see it as a resource to take advantage of.
Yeah, and I think it's also it's super valuable having groups like this, right? It's that, hey, look, like we're experts and we're coming to you, right? I think it's oftentimes it's the policymakers finding an expert group or experts within the field, and oftentimes those experts are not necessarily neutral. You know what I mean? They have outside interests, where if you're coming at it from purely an ethical standpoint and going to policymakers with that, I think that is an incredibly valuable resource for policymakers. And I think also the Waterloo MP, like Bardish Trager, is very influential within the current liberal government, and B, like she's been here and she's engaged in what's going on with AI, with quantum in Waterloo.
And I've met
Yeah.
Sarah and myself and Anna all met with her back in February. She was thrilled about it. She gave us she gave us twice as much time as she had budgeted. And she was very interested and excited about what could be done in this space. And now we want to think about, maybe we want to talk to Mike Morris, the federal representative for Waterloo. And as we're cultivating these relationships with lawmakers, thinking about externalizing all this stuff we've been talking about, and maybe that's a project. What if we came to a lawmaker with a policy brief? What would be in it?
Yeah, and that's kind of what we're gonna get into here, because the podcast does kind of present a few ideas of like, okay, well, what would regulation look like? And I think each of these have merits. None of them stood out to me as like, oh yeah, that's the fix, but it's really never that simple. So the first of which was regulating GPUs. I see this as like kind of targeting the base of the pyramid, right? Like what are the underlying things you need for this to happen? The question is, what does that look like, right? Like when you say regulating GPUs, does that mean there are certain numbers sold each year? If that is the case, you say we have 100 to sell this year. Like, hey, I don't know how many GPUs it would take for one model to be developed, right? So however many, you have a number, and then who gets those? Who decides who gets those? Because as we kind of touched on, you don't want to end up in a situation where all of the available units are going to 2 companies or 3 companies, right? So how does that work in practice? And then how do you enforce it? Like, what do you do, or how do you know if someone starts pulling in GPUs from elsewhere in the world, right? Or, the other thing is, what if they just leave? Like, oh, we're regulating this here. Well, we're gonna go to Ireland. We're gonna do it in Ireland. And we've seen that with a lot of like home offices for these big tech companies exist in really random locations based on like tax benefits and regulations. And so you want to be able to regulate while avoiding that, because then you're losing the competitive advantage of saying, hey, look, like we have all of this tech here and they're developing it here. So the enforcement of that and what it actually looks like leaves some questions, and maybe we can kind of brainstorm some at the end, but I think it's a valuable idea. It's just, how do you operationalize it? How do you make it work in practice? Auditing regimes, kind of like a licensing procedure similar to what we see with doctors and lawyers. Again, I think this is a great idea. This is the one for me, I think, makes the most sense in terms of how it would work in practice. But again, who decides who gets licenses, right? Like they mention kind of like a board of AI experts that maybe could kind of facilitate something like this. Yeah, that totally works. But then are there a certain number of licenses you give out? How do you enforce it if people are acting without a license? And how do you monitor? How do you even know? Right?
The concept of an audit has come up in this reading group before, race. The audit, I think even before race week, even in the summer free launch one, we were like talking about how do we like decide or like have a panel of experts that can screen for kind of good applications or bad or yeah. And then this one is also, it's harder to like, what if like, if because of this auditing procedure, you're delaying kind of smaller companies who can't move as fast, and then they lose out again to like bigger companies. It's all the same thing.
Right. Totally. Well, that and two, I think it can be difficult, like as they mentioned, like you need a lot of resources to enforce this, right? And you need, for example, you need a lot of experts that are willing to work on the enforcement side rather than the R&D side. And with it being a frontier technology where it's kind of in unknown territory, I don't see you convincing that many people, hey, we need you to be on the enforcement side rather than this. And so the resources and the amount of money it takes to put into that can also be very difficult to achieve. And then also like that, I feel that's one of the first things that gets cut in like a national budget, right? So it's very difficult to find the money and the manpower to make all of that work. The third thing they mention are KYC laws, or like know your consumer, know your customer. This I think is also a very interesting. Knowing or keeping track of who is doing what with the technology, I think is valuable, but to what end are you keeping track of this, right? What sort of regulatory framework do you have to kind of put a leash on people that are maybe going too far or in the wrong direction as you see it? And so again, where's the regulation? What does the enforcement look like kind of downstream, right? So again, it's a valuable concept, but how do you turn that knowledge into something useful that can be kind of put within a regulatory framework? And finally, a liability regime in terms of like making cloud providers liable for what happens on their what they're providing. And this one I think is too broad stroke. It's too large, mostly because I can just picture like a large company being held liable for something and them saying, hey, we're not liable. And then you go to court and takes 5 years and then it's irrelevant, right? And again, the resources there is like, even if you have the resources to kind of call them out and say, this is what you're doing wrong, or this happened, it's your fault, then you need the resources to go through the legal battle. And they have infinite resources in that regard. And as they touch on in the podcast, that's a cost that the company writes off as like expenses, you know, like they're willing to pay that just to do that, right? Like it's fine in terms of the amount of money that they're making. So again, it's how do you actually enforce this? And I think that's the biggest problem because of the size and scope of the corporations that are using the technology, that in a lot of ways they're larger than most national governments. And so as I was kind of talking about, with you kind of need them at the table with you talking about being willing to be regulated and like kind of follow the rules that you're giving them. And I think that's where the difficulty really comes in. And I think that's where positioning Canada globally is very important, because it's a lot easier to get them to the table if it's not just Canada, right? If you're saying, hey, we have this regulation, but that regulation also exists here, here, and here. So it's in your best interest to follow this because you're going to have to there and you're going to have to here. So really, it's probably just easier to like maintain the standard across the board. But then you have to get all the other countries on board with that as well, right? And I don't know how much international politics you guys are familiar with, but UN meetings, I think at least they feel that they have bigger fish to fry. So
You worked at UN.
I did, yeah. Yeah. And it's I mean, not to devalue the issues that they are working on, but I do see this as something where, you know, you've the climate change meetings and obviously incredibly important. But, you know, if you were to have taken the climate change meetings more seriously 35 years ago, right, then you're in a much better position now. And I see where we're at right now with AI is 35 years ago, right? And so it's like, can we do that now as opposed to way down the line when it's like, if we don't do this right now, we're in big trouble. So it's going to be interesting to see. And I'm very curious kind of what your guys' take on these ideas are, because I'm coming at it from a policy perspective, as opposed to like a research development kind of from the technology side. And I'm sure that I have a very different angle on this than probably you do. But yes, shoot. Mm-hmm.
Like difficult for the reasons you said. It's difficult because AI algorithms are the like treasure of these companies. They are so valuable to them and they're constantly evolving, and they're, you know, the Google algorithm changes all the time because they don't want people to figure out how it works. So when you're going about proving liability, not only do you have to do everything you said, you also have to figure out a way to prove that it's the algorithm and not some other like weird excuse the company comes up with, right?
Right.
Because they're gonna guard those secrets with their lives. It's everything to them, so.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a perfect point to kick us off for the discussion period.
Perfect.
Yeah, so will you be able to join us for the next couple
Totally,
of
yeah.
minutes? All right, great. I'm going to, let's just thank Mike again for an excellent talk.
Thank you, guys.
All right, we're gonna turn the recording off now.